Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform for building your brand and growing your business online. I'll talk more about them in a bit. If you know one thing about the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank, or PIAT, the British Empire's go-to anti-tank weapon of World War II, you probably know that it was a complete heap of junk, a joke of a weapon that propelled a small projectile at laughable speeds towards tanks it had no chance of damaging, all while the Americans and Germans got to strut around with top-of-the-line rocket launchers that would make mincemeat of any armored vehicle unfortunate enough to find itself in their crosshairs. This idea is a pervasive one, having been dominant since the first histories of World War II were written in the late 1940s. But is it actually a correct one? Well, today we're going to be answering that question by delving into the history of the PIAT and seeing if it really does deserve its reputation as one of the worst anti-tank weapons of World War II. There can be few better places to start when evaluating the merits of a weapon than with the testimony of those who actually had to use the thing under fire, so let's begin our analysis with exactly that. Before we delve into it, however, it is important to note that we must contextualize these opinions and remember just how subjective witness testimony can be. Make no mistake, they provide an absolutely valuable insight into understanding how the PIAT performed in combat, but these opinions, like all opinions, will be affected by the prejudice of the lived experience. For example, a soldier who received extensive training on the PIAT is far more likely to have a positive impression of the weapon than a soldier who only received a brief demonstration. Similarly, a soldier who frequently had to haul its 32-pound mass on long route marches but never use it in combat can naturally be assumed to lean more towards having a negative opinion. With that said, let's dive into those opinions. Our first testimony comes from Lieutenant Colonel Richard Lonsdale, commanding officer of the 11th Parachute Battalion. He became very familiar with the PIAT during the Battle of Arnhem when he fired it in anger many times. His perception of the weapon was positive, noted in a report dated the 21st of October 1944 that, quote, "At short range, they are a good and destructive weapon." This opinion was echoed by another Arnhem veteran, William Carter of the 1st Parachute Battalion, who noted that the PIAT was perfectly effective in the anti-tank role. Interestingly, this same positive impression can be found in civilian onlookers also, such as BBC war correspondent Robert Dunnett, who had the following to say on the PIAT during a radio broadcast from the 22nd of June 1944. To quote, "If ever an infantry weapon has justified its existence, that weapon is the PIAT. Every day one hears of German tanks knocked out or at least immobilized by PIATs. In copses, behind hedges, among groups of ruined buildings, in any sort of position where our men can find cover enough to creep up on them with their PIATs, our infantry swear by the PIATs." End quote. So, do you want to stand out with a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and sell anything, products, content you create, even your time? Well, let me tell you about today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace has many features. First up, member areas. Look, if you're a creator or educator, then this feature can be a game changer for you. You can now monetize your content and experience by selling access to gated content like classes, online courses, or newsletters. This is a fantastic way to unlock a new revenue stream for your business while freeing up more time in your schedule. Next up, email campaigns. Stand out in any email inbox with Squarespace email campaigns. Collect email subscribers, convert them into loyal customers. Easy. Plus, built-in analytics allow you to measure the impact of every email send and improve your email marketing strategy. And finally, analytics. With Squarespace, you can gain powerful insights into who's visiting your site and how they're interacting with your content. You can track page views, traffic sources, time on site, most read content, audience geography, and much more. That is just scratching the surface. It's a must-have feature for any business owner looking to optimize their website's performance. Head to squarespace.com and start your free trial today. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/megaprojects to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring. And now back to today's video. Now, of course, as a BBC war correspondent, he is likely to show a positive bias, but it is certainly interesting how, like Lieutenant Colonel Lonsdale, he stresses the effectiveness of the PIAT at short range. These opinions are certainly useful, but they have their limitations because they ultimately are the opinions of just a few individuals. If we wish to really get to the meat of the matter, we need some sort of macro data. And fortunately, we have exactly that in the form of battle experience questionnaires. Now, battle experience questionnaires are exactly what they sound like. They're questionnaires given to combat veterans to give the higher-ups a better understanding of their soldiers' experiences on the ground. Sort of like how you get a follow-up after buying something online, except a lot darker. Now, of particular interest to us is a series of battle experience questionnaires completed by Canadian officers of the 1st Battalion, the Calgary Highlanders, who served both in the Mediterranean and Northwest European theatres. One question in particular asked if they considered any weapon to be outstandingly effective, and shockingly, the PIAT, contrary to its popular contemporary perception, received more positive responses than any other weapon, with a whopping 74 out of 150 responses mentioning the PIAT in their answer. Captain W.L. Leister, one of the aforementioned 150 respondents, went into particular depth and praised the PIAT's versatility, claiming it to be very useful for house clearing, further adding that it had great blasting power. The men who know how to use it and love it. We can also trust that these answers are honest because, when the respondents did not like a weapon, they were really not shy about that fact, as evidenced by Captain R.D. Bacon of the 1st Battalion, the Calgary Highlanders, who had some very demonetizable things to say about the number 68 and number 74 anti-tank grenades, and claimed that the PIAT was so much better, and that there was no anti-tank weapon his men would rather use. In another set of battle experience questionnaires, a particularly interesting response can be found from Major W.C. Allen of 1st Battalion, the West Nova Scotia Regiment, who praised the psychological impact the PIAT had on the enemy, noting that enemy tanks did not relish the PIAT and could be forced to turn tail moderately easy. In particular, he believed that this psychological effect played a pivotal part in reliably repelling German counterattacks, as the enemy tanks supporting infantry always, quote, broke except on very rare occasions. Thanks to the breadth of these Canadian battle experience questionnaires, we are finally able to start forming some solid and well-substantiated conclusions and state that Canadian officers were typically happy with the PIAT. What appears to have helped the PIAT was the fact that its shortcomings, particularly its short effective range, were discussed openly and honestly, allowing every soldier equipped with it to be able to make the most of its capabilities. The idea that the PIAT was effective so long as it was used correctly comes up repeatedly in veteran testimonials, clearly demonstrating just how important this frank discussion of its shortcomings was to its success. This is demonstrated by Sergeant James Wyndham, who was issued with a PIAT during the Italian campaign and stated that it was highly effective so long as the operator waited until the target was sufficiently close, and Lance Corporal George Drew of the 8th Battalion, the Suffolk Regiment, who stated that the PIAT was useful so long as the target was close enough to score a hit in the right place. But as much as we have now established that there are plenty of positive veteran opinions of the PIAT, we mustn't think this represents all veteran opinions on it, as there are also plenty of negative takes to be found. Notably, however, many of these opinions appear to come from exposure to early production PIATs, which, owing to its rush development, still had many kinks to be ironed out. One such negative take on the PIAT comes from Anthony Colgan of the 9th Battalion, the Durham Light Infantry. He was introduced to the PIAT in 1943, and after seeing an instructor accurately blow up a target across a small valley, he was quite excited to have a play with the weapon himself. He struggled to replicate the accuracy of his instructor, however, and after missing 3 shots in succession, his opinion of the PIAT was that it was an inaccurate gimmick. In addition to complaints about accuracy, such as Corporal Harry Martin of the 7th Battalion also believed that the PIAT was actively dangerous to operate due to its immense recoil, with potential to break the operator's shoulder. Fortunately, claims such as these can be tested with modern experimentation, as we can fire PIATs ourselves today. Indeed, the author of the piece today has actually done this and can report that they're perfectly safe to operate if they're fired correctly. There are 2 caveats to this, however. Firstly, PIATs are now 80 years old and their operating springs have weakened somewhat, and that firing a PIAT in the controlled conditions of a range is not reflective of battlefield conditions. These limitations do not eliminate the usefulness of contemporary experimentation, however, as useful conclusions such as the PIAT not being intrinsically dangerous can be garnered, but it is important to critically temper our conclusions. This practical evidence, combined with further original testimony, allows us to conclude that injuries caused by the PIAT were usually the result of operator error. Bruce Bruce Coombs of the 6th Battalion adds further nuance by explaining that the injuries were often caused by operators relaxing their grip during the delay between pulling the trigger and the projectile being launched, which was caused by the travel time of the PIAT's internal spring. Notably, however, Coombs had an overall positive impression of the weapon. But as much as we can explain the PIAT's tendency to cause injury, we should not dismiss it, as it still presented a real drawback. This tendency not only reduced the immediate effectiveness of the weapon by risking taking soldiers out of action if injured, but it also meant that many soldiers that would be issued it would be scared of the thing and therefore not use it effectively. Further evidence of a fear of the PIAT comes from Private Eddie Carter. He trained with the PIAT in 1949 and noted how many of his fellow conscripts struggled to get to grips with its recoil, with several, including himself, outright disliking or fearing the weapon. The juxtaposition between these negative and positive opinions raises a question. How can two men come away with such different opinions of the very same weapon? An explanation might be found in their periods of service. As a World War II veteran, Coombs was familiar with the old and ineffective anti-tank rifles that the PIAT replaced, and saw with his own eyes just how effective the PIAT could be in combat when used effectively. Clark, who trained on the PIAT post-war, had none of this experience. He was simply handed a PIAT out of the blue and did not have the wider perspective of Coombs. Small wonder, then, that he was glad to see the back of the PIAT, which kicked like a horse, in favor of the much more comfortable recoil-free bazooka. But veteran complaints regarding the PIAT were not just limited to the accuracy and the safety of the weapon, as there were also complaints about the ergonomics of the weapon. Specifically, people complained about the difficulty in cocking it. Major John Graham recalled the cocking method with much ire, during which he had to stand up and put all of his strength into the weapon, a process which he described as dangerous when under enemy fire. The weight of the PIAT was also a frequent complaint. An anonymous soldier from the official war history of the 25th New Zealand Infantry Battalion recalled how he was issued a PIAT when he was posted to the unit, and how its weight always seemed to double by the time he reached the top of a steep hill. This complaint is a curious one, because while the PIAT was significantly heavier than its direct equivalents, weighing in at 32 pounds compared to 20 pounds for the German Panzerschreck and 16 pounds for the American bazooka, it was not absurdly heavy, and certainly not heavier than other equipment the anonymous soldiers may have been expected to carry, with the Vickers gun, including its tripod, and wireless set number 19, weighing in at roughly 80 and 90 pounds respectively. This presents an interesting dilemma then. We know that few humans savor physical hardship, and that during a physical ordeal, we are unlikely to be thinking on the finer nuances of the task. But how far should we take this into account in our conclusions? Ultimately, the answer to that is a completely subjective one, and one that you will have to decide for yourself. We also know that many British soldiers preferred foreign anti-tank weapons to their own PIAT, as evidenced by Lieutenant Sidney Jarry of the 4th Battalion, who noted that the German Panzerschreck had a long range and was lighter than his own PIAT, and went on further to compliment the cheap and cheerful Panzerfaust, claiming it to be light, accurate, and destructive. A final point to consider is that an individual soldier having success with the PIAT was no guarantee that they would have a favourable opinion of the weapon. Private Lionel Roebuck was the first British soldier to destroy a German tank in Operation Coup de Main, a feat he accomplished using a PIAT, and he had a very poor opinion of it, claiming it to be too short-ranged and effectively a one-shot weapon, owing to how difficult it was to reload. So now that we've thoroughly analysed the opinions of veterans, let's broaden our analysis and take a look at other metrics we can use to assess the weapon. Let's begin by looking at how many enemy vehicles were destroyed by the PIAT during the war. This is more difficult than it may first seem, because no great macro data was ever compiled on this matter, so like our veteran accounts, we're forced to take what data we can find and use it to plot overall trends. One such dataset, compiled by 21st Century Army Group's Operational Research Section, analyzes German tank losses between the 6th of June and the 31st of August 1944 during Operation Overlord, and concludes that the PIAT accounted for 7% of all German tank kills during this period. And this figure is even more impressive in a wider context, as Allied roving air patrols, the menace that so many historians will tell you brought the Panzer divisions to a standstill, only accounted for 6% of German tank losses over the same period. Or we can also look at the penetration data of the PIAT. Normally such data is gathered by testing a weapon under laboratory conditions, conditions in which it is fired at various thicknesses of metal plate, and by seeing what it does and doesn't penetrate, a reasonably accurate picture of its performance can be built. This approach has its flaws, however. There is more to a tank than a simple plate of metal, and such data doesn't give a true indication of a weapon's destructive potential, as actual tanks have crews, fuel tanks, ammunition racks, and the like that will be affected when it comes under fire. Fortunately for us, however, we do not have to depend upon such sanitized and potentially unreliable data today, thanks to a report compiled by Captain F.W. Burton of the Small Arms School Corps in late March 1943. In this report, Burton presents a comprehensive study into the effectiveness of the PIAT against actual enemy tanks by examining wrecked tanks and testing the PIAT himself against recovered tanks. He first tested it on a Panzer II and noted that the PIAT had no issues penetrating the thickest part of the tank, 0.6 inches of armor on its front. He also placed petrol cans in the Panzer II's crew positions and noted that these were riddled with holes with much evidence of splash damage. He then repeated this test with a recovered Panzer III and had the same success, with the PIAT easily penetrating the 2.4 inches of traditional armor and additional 0.4 inches of spaced armor that the Panzer III had at its thickest point in one shot. He also noted how the PIAT punched straight through the Panzer III's gun mantlet, which was 1.6 inches thick and sloped at 15 degrees. He then upped the ante significantly and trialed the PIAT against a Tiger I, with the PIAT penetrating the 3.2-inch thick turret armor with ease, but completely failing to penetrate the 4.1-inch thick front armor of the Tiger I despite 3 separate attempts. On this final failure, however, he noted that the armor was significantly dented and that spalling would still likely injure the crew. Further evidence of the PIAT's destructive capabilities came from an investigation carried out by the experimental establishment Schuberinus in December 1942. Like Captain F.W. Burton's later experiment with the Panzer III, this investigation was designed to test the effectiveness of the PIAT against spaced armor, and saw it being fired at a 0.8-inch thick steel plate from 150 feet, 7.7 inches behind which was a second 2-inch thick steel plate. This test was a complete failure, a stark difference to Burton's experiment. If nothing else, the experiment serves to highlight exactly why real experiments are more useful than those conducted under laboratory conditions. As for these results specifically, it is noticeable that Burton's test was conducted well beyond the effective 100 feet range of the PIAT, so for our purposes today, we can conclude that an unrepresentative experiment such as this should have little bearing on our overall conclusions. Further damning evidence comes from the Army Operational Research Group in February 1944. This report solely concerns the accuracy of the PIAT and discussed a series of tests carried out to plot the accuracy of the weapon against moving tanks. The report concluded that it was only reliably possible to hit a tank when it was moving either towards or away from the operator, and that hitting any kind of tank moving sideways was simply impossible without a hell of a lot of luck. More damning still, the report concluded that it was all but impossible to hit any specific part of a tank if it was moving in any direction, although scoring a hit was possible. Certainly not a great result for the PIAT, but in the context of everything else we've learned about it, is this enough to damn the weapon? So, now that we've finished our analysis of the wide-ranging evidence regarding the PIAT, we're finally now in a position to start coming to some opinions on the effectiveness of the weapon. We've seen how the PIAT was far from perfect, and it suffered from some very real drawbacks, with even its fiercest advocates rightly claiming that it had a very limited range and that operators had to be very careful to use it correctly. And we've also seen how its most ardent critics were scared of the weapon and believed it to be woefully inaccurate. But equally, having taken the time to critically analyze both sides of this debate, this juxtaposition no longer stands in the way of us coming to a reasoned conclusion, and we can appreciate both sides of this argument in a wider context. As for us, we think it's fair to say that the PIAT was absolutely fine. It was perfectly usable within a specific set of parameters that were realistic on the battlefield, and when used this way, it had a reasonable enough chance of not only hitting its targets, but doing significant damage to them when it did. Would we choose to carry one? Absolutely not, and if we had a choice, just give us the Panzerschreck any day. But if you didn't have a choice, you could do a lot worse than a PIAT, despite its many flaws. But what about you guys out there in the audience? Have you arrived at a different conclusion? The answer to today's question is subjective. It has no right or wrong answer, so if you think differently, let us know in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching.